Now, detonate the reality bomb!
I will build a great, great wall.
Some alien race to come down and threaten us.
Is the singularity near?
The truth is out there.
The military-industrial complex.
The 7 mountains of the influencers of culture.
To be as gods, you know.
Change has come to America.
Catapult of propaganda.
From a secure location on top of the ridge in the heart of the beautiful Missouri Ozarks, this is A View from the Bunker. Now, here's Derek Gilbert.
If you're listening to this show, there's a good chance that you're a futurist in terms of Bible prophecy. But what if all of the stuff that we think is still to come in the future was actually fulfilled, or much of it anyway, about 2,000 years ago? Welcome to A View from the Bunker. I'm Derek Gilbert. Joining me today once again for another discussion with a heretical preterist, or partial thereof. And we do this in love and with great friendship. A gentleman we are honored and very proud to call a friend. He is the author of a number of best-selling series of novels, which we recommend because they really help you to visualize the spiritual war in which you are deployed. Chronicles of the Nephilim, Chronicles of the Watchers, and now he's working through Chronicles of the Apocalypse. The first book was Tyrant, Rise of the Beast. Book 2, Remnant, Rescue of the Elect. And now Book 3, Resistant, Revolt of the Jews. We're honored that he and his lovely bride chose to join us on our tour of Israel this May, and we welcome back to the program Brian Godawa. Brian, good to see you again, brother.
Thanks for having me, Derek. It was great going on the trip with you. My wife loved you too, and we had a fun time, going around all the places in Israel. And while you said, and this is what's going to happen in the future, and I would come in and say, no, that already happened in the past. So, we're just joking.
Sort of a spiritual firing line sort of thing here. This is really interesting, and I am trying to make more time to read for pleasure because over the last couple of years, as I've been digging into ancient Near Eastern cosmology, what did the Amorites believe? What did the Akkadians believe? How is that reflected in the Hebrew scriptures? You get to a point where you just need to step back and take a little bit of a break. So I'm trying to do that again, and your books are what I'm picking up. So I appreciate you sharing the new book, Resistant, with me, especially. And let me start here, just before we get into some of the prophetic things and the reason that you take a different view of Bible prophecy, apocalyptic prophecy. The trip to Israel and the tour of Jerusalem and some of those sites, especially walking through the tunnels. And by the way, you'll get a chance to see some of this video because I'm including this in the DVD that we're calling Wars of the Gods, Volume 1, Search for the Titans, showing some of the tunnels and the pictures that we took under the city streets in Jerusalem, and realizing that there were people who were hiding from the Romans in those tunnels. How did seeing that with your own eyes affect you after all the research you've done for the series Chronicles of the Apocalypse?
Well, it's going to be a little bit disappointing because I didn't get to go to that one that day. I was sick, and I ended up going back home, I actually missed it. Listen, there's a lot of things I wanted to see. But I got to tell you this. So I'm writing the series Chronicles of the Apocalypse. It's all about the first century, Jewish revolt which ended in AD 70 with the destruction of the temple and the city Jerusalem, right? So there's a lot of relevancy in one sense to that, obviously. And it was cool to go and see certain locations and such. But in all honesty, the stuff even that I did see, even the Temple Mount and stuff like that we were able to see on the outside and all that, honestly, as a writer, I do a lot of research, which also includes pictures. Thank God for the internet, right? Mm-hmm, right. But the truth is it actually didn't help me that much. I have to say it really didn't. Most of I had it right anyway. But again, it wasn't because of me. It was because of the research and such. And now I'm not saying that doesn't always that always happens that way. I thought that there would be sort of an inspiration, but there wasn't. But I do want to say that I believe that speaks to the power of our imagination that God gave us, where in some ways. It's almost like, I don't want to see that because, it might stultify my ability to tell a good story because, as you know, when you're writing fiction, you're sometimes you exaggerate a little or, whatever, you're flowery, whatever, it's something that can help catch the feel of the moment in the story. Sometimes you cheat a little, let's put it that way, right? But the truth is, in general, I prefer, especially if you're writing something historical, of course, I like being there. And some of the locations, it was interesting because it showed me that there was enough latitude for my imagination in telling the story. So, yeah, I don't know.
That was something that struck us when we were down in the tunnels, and Sharon and I talked about it later and realized that, in some of the places that we were walking where we were able to look up and see from underground the opening of a cistern that would have been inside a home in first century Jerusalem. And it was in places like that people, unlike our tour group where we were, joking and laughing and enjoying the fellowship and just taking in all of these amazing historical sites, but realizing that 2,000 years ago, there were men, women, and children who were huddling in fear and praying to Yahweh to save them. And sadly, many of them were.
That's a really good point.
So, I mean, that was a powerful thing to experience. But as you point out in your book and also in the previous book, A Remnant Rescue of the Elect, many of the Christians in the first century took the prophesied abomination of desolation seriously and got out of Jerusalem when they saw the Roman legions coming. So let's talk about that and other reasons that you take many of the things that futurists, like myself, will assume or interpret as future events and see those as having fulfillment in the first century.
Yeah, that's a good question. A good lead up because, for your audience too, to just remind them, you already mentioned futurist in general is you feel that, and let's look, as a preterist, I believe there are some things still in the future. So,
okay.
Like the future resurrection and judgment, whatever. But I would define us differently. When I use the term preterist and futurist, at least in our discussion, I kind of see it as, the futurist believes that the last days are the last days of the earth that are in our future, whereas a preterist would say, no, I believe the last days means the last days of the old covenant. That's why they were in the past. And the end of the cosmos, or the world that the Jews were writing about, had more to do with the spiritual reality of the covenant than about the physical universe. And so that's kind of how we're coming at it. But the series of Chronicles of the Apocalypse. So most of the, as we know, there's thanks to Left Behind, there's a huge market, and I don't speak negatively of that. There's a huge market for people writing, fictional novels about what the future fulfillment of the Book of Revelation might be, and so it's necessarily speculative and science fiction and such. But what I wanted to do was something different. I wanted to go back and tell the origin story of the Book of Revelation. In other words, write about what John and writing it and what was the time like in their time period, because the context of that is not just an action epic, but it's momentous in terms of the history of Christianity and Judaism. So, for example, in the 60s, you've got Nero as the Caesar. He starts on the first systematic persecution of Christians in history. Now, the Jews had persecuted the Christians in the Book of Acts. We know about that, right? But it wasn't systematic and led by a pagan government, et cetera, right? Mm-hmm. So he embarks on the systematic persecution of Christians that we now know about as being thrown to the lions and all that kind of stuff. And not only that, but the historical events that occur, the Jews of that time period are still looking for Messiah, and they've become convinced that Messiah is about to come and free them from the Romans, and they get the kind of courage or whatever, whatever. They get the courage to stand up and expect it, and so they engage in a revolt that starts around 67 AD or so, mm-hmm. and be more like 66 and a half AD or something. Anyway, so they start the Jewish revolt. They rise up, and then Rome has to send the armies, legions, over to quench it. And what they end up doing is Caesar sends Vespasian, the general, and his son Titus to basically take care of it. 4 legions and tens of thousands of auxiliary units and stuff from all the nations, basically. And he sends them over there. And what they end up doing is they end up leveling the whole Judea and Samaria, the whole land, basically. They subdue the whole thing and leave Jerusalem for the last, right? Because that's the key. And that's also a very fortified city. And they could very successfully hold off the Romans. So what Vespasian does is he takes care of, the whole land so that there's sort of the morale is gone. Then they surround Jerusalem. Now, what happens at that point in history is Nero commits suicide, so Vespasian has to go back and he becomes emperor, but his son Titus then finishes up the task, and he besieges Jerusalem for about 5 months, and then that's what ultimately ends in the destruction of the city of Jerusalem and the temple's never been rebuilt. So that's sort of an amazing time period of history that I think we need to understand better. Because it changed Judaism forever. It was because of that, because of the loss of the temple, then some Jews went over to Yavne. They were given a privilege by Vespasian to go to Yavne and reboot their religion, basically. And that's where we get the rabbinic Talmudic Judaism of today that replaces the Torah with a system without the temple. See, so modern day Judaism is not biblical. It's not Torah oriented. It's Talmud oriented and rabbinic oriented. And the reason why is because they need to create a excuse why they don't engage in the Torah practices of the temple. Right. And but it also is significant for Christianity because until that point in time, Christianity was still closely connected to its mother religion of Judaism. Most of the Christians, or at least the Christians in Israel, most of them were Jewish Christians, the sort of the headquarters was still sort of Jerusalem. And as if you read the New Testament letters, you see Paul making this really strong argument for against that sort of unity of the Torah religion with Christianity. He's sort of separating the two, and the Christians really weren't able to separate fully until that thing was wiped out. Jerusalem was wiped out, and then it sort of forced the Christians to get out into the rest of the world. And from that point in history, of course, Christianity grew. So, that long-winded discourse was just to say this is a fascinating time period in history. I wanted to tell that story. But the second element, which is what you were getting at, and that was that. Oh, and so by the way, that's why I think I'm writing this series, knowing full well that my viewpoint is not a majority viewpoint, and a lot of people a lot of people with their beliefs about the end times and last days. They're very, very, shall we say, to put it kindly, very strong-minded and oftentimes not willing to really consider other viewpoints and easily condemning others. So I know I'm in this sort of milieu, and I thought, well, I want to tell a story that you don't have to agree with my viewpoint, because you'll still appreciate the historical accuracy, which I do intensive research, as well as sort of the divine counsel motif that I bring into the story, which I know your audience will be very familiar with. Yeah. I carried it over from Chronicles of the Nephilim, and it's the notion that there are watchers over the nations, and that when there's an earthly battle, there's also a spiritually battle, because as we claim, the Bible says that there are earthly principalities and powers there are spiritual principalities and powers behind the earthly powers, and they're linked in a very intimate way. And so that's the picture that the scriptures show. And I wanted to bring that in because Revelation is sort of like that, it's got that real spiritual side of things, much more so than some of the other New Testament books, right? So I wanted to bring that picture in, and I have that as well, where I've got the watchers and all that, and so I wanted to make it an entertaining as well as an interesting theological book, even if you don't agree with eschatology. So now get to the eschatology. Part of my thing of doing it in the first century was I wanted to try to also go into why I think that the ancient first century Jewish mindset, how they might interpret the book of Revelation being, at that time period, particularly Christian Jews, but how they would see it and how they might apply it to their time period. And that would be shocking for a lot of people, but I feel that when you read the drama of my storytelling, I think what storytelling does is it's able to flesh things out in a very sort of a deep existential way through storytelling that a theological book can't always accomplish. I write theological books too, but and some people don't like going into all the in-depth stuff, theology and eschatology, right? Mm-hmm. So I wanted to sort of embody that. I think that was the power of Left Behind. I'm not ripping off Left Behind because I've told, a dozen Bible stories. So this is the culmination of me writing for the last 6 years from Genesis to Revelation. But I do recognize the reason why Left Behind was so powerful and effective was it was good entertaining storytelling, at least for some people. Mm-hmm. I didn't think so, but I acknowledge that a lot of people felt it was great.
I agree with you there. I kind of lost interest as I realized, he's going to stretch this out for 12 books. Oh, brother.
Yeah.
And then I started noticing that some of the secondary characters, a lot of the secondary characters had names that were drawn from the names of Major League Baseball players in the 60s and 70s. Like, okay.
Funny.
Funny, yeah. Don Clendenin. Okay. Oh,
yeah. Well, look, I treat the Left Behind like I treat James Cameron, right? I think lots of people they just hate the formulaic, obviousness or whatever of James Cameron's storytelling. But look, he's the most watched filmmaker in all of history.
The elements
got to
work.
Got to
the formula
admit he knows something about storytelling because he's doing something right.
Right. So taking nothing away from Jerry B. Jenkins, right? He knows how to put the elements of a story together, and it worked.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But what that tells me is it captures the excitement of theology in a way that that maybe theology can't. Theology books can't. Now, I'm at a disadvantage because it's much more exciting and sensationalistic to write about futuristic, chips in the hands and the Nephilim being cloned and all that kind of stuff. And I'm here trying to say, all this language that you read, this very symbolic language in Revelation, I'm saying, well, it's not, they're not cloned locusts with human heads or whatever. I'm literally saying, no, this is a symbolic thing that's referenced to something that actually happened and such. But I think that it's fascinating to people, and it has been because I do have fans who say, hey, I don't agree with your eschatology, but I'm really enjoying the books because they're really. I'm trying to apply that technique of saying, let's try to see and understand this stuff within their perspective and their mindset. So that's sort of the big setup. We can go into more details, but as you said, so the third book that I just released. It's the third of 4. I'm already deep into the last book. It's gonna be cranked out in a few months probably, because I sort of outlined the last 2 because they were very intimately connected. Right. But so this last one, the Revolt of the Jews. Now, it's like 68 to 69 A.D. and I tell the story of the Roman armies and Titus and Vespasian, what they're doing in Israel, and how the Christians and Jews are dealing with it. And one of the things you mentioned earlier was, in the second book of this series, I did try to deal with the historical aspect of where were the Christians at this time. And, there's not a lot of ancient church fathers who've written, there is some out there, but there's also some contradictory stuff and we don't always know. So, but there are indications such as Eusebius, a famous church historian, who writes about how the Christians who were in Jerusalem left the city because of the prophecy and the references to what Christ said that, when Jerusalem's surrounded by armies, know that its end is near and flee to the mountains. Mm-hmm. And so he says, and they went to Pella. And interestingly enough, I tell that whole story in Remnant, the second book, because what happens is I start the whole series with like the Great Fire of Rome and Nero starting the persecution of Jews. Why? Christians. Why? Because he hears that there's this it's kind of like a Da Vinci Code. I call it my ancient Da Vinci Code story, because he hears that there's this letter going around, subversive letter to the empire that's predicting the end of the empire or the world and the assassination of Caesar, right? So he's like, I want to find this. So he sends out a Roman warrior who has a Jewish doctor and a Christian slave who's a woman with them. So you get from all three perspectives. He's hunting down this letter that the Christians are hiding, and he's got to find who it is and kill him if he has to, and all that. And how, who is this returning, this Jesus Redivivus? Is he, what is this? Is this a military guy who's pretending to be the dead Jewish Nazarene? What's going on? So as they're researching, they come upon John at Patmos and they learn more details. But then ultimately they conclude that with the help of John, that Rome is going to be coming and they're going to be destroying the city, and this is God's judgment. As Jesus predicted in Matthew 23 and 24, he said, that because this generation, the first generation, is going to reject me and kill me, Messiah, God is going to destroy your house, or the temple of God, and not one stone will be left upon another. So Jesus is saying that the seriousness of rejecting Messiah is sort of the apex of all rejection of all the prophets. So it's all going to be on you guys, basically. And whoa, that's heavy, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm telling a story, and we know that, you read the Gospels and how dense were the disciples. Even after he died, the Gospels tell, he told you about resurrection, and like, what? He's going to raise from the dead? I told you about that, So they're dense, and who knows how dense and how long.
Are you going to restore the kingdom to Israel now?
Yeah.
40 days after his death. Yeah.
Yeah, and then the book of Acts, where it's like, we can't let those Gentiles into the church, So we're stupid, we got to learn these things. So my premise there is, what if the letter had not got to Israel, because it was written at first it was written to the 7 churches of Asia Minor, right? Mm-hmm. So they got to get the letter there, and they got to tell the Christians, but not all the Christians agreed, because a lot of them are still Judaizers, and a lot of them are questioning whether or not it's true. So it's this whole issue: will the Christians get out of the city in time? And of course I do have them get out, and that shouldn't spoil it, because they're still good angels in warfare and stuff. So that's what I'm telling in that story. So they basically get out, but something about that I think is really important, and that is one of the things I do in this whole series is that just because I believe God cares about his own, he's going to, he loves his people, he loves Christians, we have all these promises from God. It doesn't mean, and that God works on works with the nations and with big things that are happening, yet he says, I will protect you. I will protect the elect. That doesn't mean absolutely everyone's going to be protected. Like, for example, when the first temple was destroyed by Babylon, it wasn't only unrighteous Jews who got killed and taken off into exile, was it?
Right.
Guess what? There were a lot of righteous Jews who got brought into exile. Mm-hmm. So in other words, my point is yes, I do believe in God's promises in general for his people, but that doesn't keep us from suffering, like all the Christians who suffered under Nero, right, and being thrown to the lions. And I try to bring that reality out that, look, God's going to bring us through this. God doesn't promise that we're going to get out of it. He promises he will go through it with us. And that's sort of one of my important themes throughout the whole series is some Christians die. Some get martyred. Some do escape. Most of them do escape, and they go to Pella. And they go to Pella because it's in the mountains in the Transjordan, and it's kind of hidden. And there is some evidence that I sort of picked up that, there was a civil war going on between the Greeks and the Jews.
Right.
And Pella was part of the Decapolis. And there is some evidence that a civil war was in the city, and they virtually killed each other. There was very little people left over, in other words. And so it might have been one of the cities that was devastated by civil wars that allowed, thousands of refugees to go to, and make their homes. Again, there's scant evidence, but there is that evidence to it. And so they go into the mountains, and there's going to be some exciting things that happen. The Christians aren't out of the story. Let's just put it that way. But and that's because of my interpretation of Revelation 12, part of Revelation 12. You know, let me get there.
The great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, the moon under her feet, or further down.
Well, it is further down, but when it gets down to the point where, and there are differences of interpretation of this, obviously, everything, let's just assume everything we talk about, there's going to be differences of interpretation.
Sure, yeah.
Everybody. But I take a lot of that, and I know Heiser talks about the astrological stuff, but in terms of the actual meaning, she gave, verse 5, she gave birth to a male child, one who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. That's Messiah.
Right.
And so I understand the woman is basically ideal Israel, not national physical Israel. It's spiritual Israel, because that's what gives birth to the Messiah. But of course, in the New Testament times, Paul says very clearly, children of Abraham are not children of the flesh; they're children of faith. So that ultimately, even throughout the Old Testament, it was the remnant that God cared about, not the whole nation. And so he did things for that remnant. That's how I understand it. So it says she gave birth to a male child, was caught up. And it says, but her child was caught up to God and his throne. I think that's the ascension. And then it says, the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God to be nourished 1,260 days, or three and a half years.
Okay.
And it so happens that the Roman trampling down of Israel and Jerusalem took 3.5 years. And
I thought there was a reason you said 66 and a half AD. Yeah, 3.5 until
Yeah. I don't have all the exact dates memorized, but they're there. They're in the books. Then there's something that elaborates on that a little further down the passage. It goes down, the dragon was thrown down into the earth, and verse 13, it says 14, but the woman was given the 2 wings of the eagle to fly from the serpent into the wilderness to the place where she is to be nourished for a time, times, and a half time. So I think that's a repetition of 1,260 days, time, times, and half time, 3.5 years, all that. And then it says the serpent poured water like a river to try to sweep her away, but the earth, So this is all symbolic imagery that I think gives an indication either of the future of the church, that Satan's still going to fight against the church, or specifically, I see it as related to those 3.5 years, because it says so, that in other words, they were still in danger. God still protected them, but they were still in danger. What kind of danger was that? Well, we don't really know for sure, but I have it in the last book. So, and I think it's cool. So they're out in the wilderness in Pella, and there's gonna be danger for the Christians as well, and that's part of the story as well. So I'm sort of telling basically the story is this: God is destroying the incarnation of the old covenant and judging the people who rejected Messiah. He is bringing forth his new people, his new bride that he will marry in place of the old harlot of unfaithful Israel who rejected him. So it's this notion of so I understand Revelation as this notion of the harlot versus the bride. And the harlot is basically apostate Israel who rejected Messiah, and they're going to be judged. They're going to be 2 witnesses, just like in the court of law, of the unfaithfulness of the harlot that then requires what? Capital punishment. And but then at the end, it's what does God say? The bride of Christ, he marries a new bride in her place. So that's kind of the big symbolic picture that I'm operating on. So that's the story I'm telling is we're seeing the destruction. Yes, God is destroying Israel and the old incarnation of the old covenant, but he's bringing forth the new kingdom of the bride of Christ. And from that point then in history, the kingdom will grow. Does that make sense?
It does. I still see it somewhat differently.
I got to shut up and let you ask some questions.
No, that's all right. This is a kind of I had the same situation a week or so ago. Sharon had to interview me for a bonus DVD that we're offering with the book, and what we're calling an off-the-record interview. And she was asking me about the connection between the Rephaim, the Titans of the Greeks, and end times prophecy, Ezekiel 38 and 39. I did the same thing. And she finally just said,
shut up. I know, because you know a lot about that stuff.
Let me ask a question. So when you get, so I get it. When you find this stuff really exciting and you want to get the information out there. So I have no problem with this.
Okay.
When you get to Revelation 13, which is where the beast rises out of the sea, the dragon is standing on the sand of the sea, and Revelation 13 begins with the beast rising out of the sea with 10 horns and 7 heads. And I would point out for readers who are not familiar with the Chronicles of the Apocalypse that Brian heavily footnotes this. So you will get all of the, not only the scriptural references, but also the historical references that he has researched and included. These novels are more heavily footnoted than most reference books, which is a good thing, because if you want to dig deeper, you don't have to turn to Wikipedia. You can just turn to the back of the book, or if you've got a Kindle or one of the ebooks, you just tap the footnote and then you can tap again and it takes you right back to the page, which is really handy.
Yes, I love that about Kindle.
Yes.
But and by the way, I don't just do citations from books. I take chunks. I make complete arguments as much as I can in short, because I knew that, again, I realize a lot of Christians are not familiar with this view, and it will almost sound absurd. Like, are you making this stuff up? What's going on? So I wanted to say, no, I'm not. And if you have any questions, you can find the answers. And because I know Christians are hungry. If they're reading something and it jars them, they want to know the answer before they keep going. And if you do, you can go, it'll jar the story a lot, but you can tap on that footnote and go find out and go, oh, that's why he's getting that idea.
Right.
Now, I try to explain it as much as I can within the story so you don't need the footnotes, but this is the world of eschatology. You can't just do flights of fancy. You got to prove things, because Christians want the Bible and they want history to prove their points. And that's why I would normally never footnote a novel. That's just, you just don't do that. But I thought, in light of this particular approach, eschatology and end times, I thought it might be helpful.
And it is, because fiction that's really engaging, especially when you're dealing with a subject like this, I'll start looking around through various resources to try to double check what I'm reading anyway. So this makes it really easy. You define the 10 horns and the 7 on the 7 heads of this beast coming out of the sea, which most prophecy scholars will agree is the Antichrist figure, as the 10 client kings of ancient Rome. Now, the identity of the 7 heads, the 10 horns, this has occupied scholars of prophecy for the last 2,000 years, ever since John wrote the thing.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious as to how this fits. I mean, people familiar with the Hal Lindsey or Left Behind series will look at this as as some form of global government and 10 regional kings. Some have even gone so far as to say it's the 10 regions of FEMA or some such thing.
Sure.
The 10 client kings of Rome. Who were they, and how do preterist scholars? How did they arrive at that interpretation of this image?
Sure. Just to sort of lay out where I'm coming from, the big picture, there's 2 beasts. There's a sea beast and a land beast.
Right.
And the sea beast comes from the sea and all that. And that, that could be a reference to the Mediterranean, which is Rome's way over the sea, but also it represents the Gentiles and chaos and all that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. So I understand the beast as being a very fluid image, actually. I'll give one example. I don't want to go through extensive stuff, but I can give one example. But it's a fluid image that is used to refer to multiple different things. Like sometimes it refers to what I think is the Roman Empire, or you just say empire, because there's a beast with 7 heads, and the 7 heads are 7 kings. Oh, okay, so that's an empire with 7 kings or whatever. But sometimes the beast is an individual, right? Where it says the mark of the beast, which is the mark of a man. So he's saying, no, this is a man. And then sometimes I think there's references where it says the beast comes out of the abyss, right?
Yes.
But he comes out of the abyss long after he's already in the play. So it's symbolism. It's not. I don't think you can take Revelation as hyper chronological by any means.
Okay. All right.
And John deliberately says, so in terms of understanding that image, I go to a later chapter because I think it's a little bit more explained later in 17. And that's where he goes into the beast with the 7 heads, and he actually does explain some of it to us. And that's where I think it helps. Because after all, if you've got someone saying, oh, this is what I mean, okay, that's going to be a helpful hermeneutic, right? So when he's talking about the beast later, he comes back to the beast and he says in 17 verse 8. Let's go to 9. This calls for wisdom. The 7 heads. So he's talking about the 7-headed dragon, and he's going to tell us this is what they are. He comes out of the vision. He says the 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman is seated. Most scholars do acknowledge this Rome. I know there's other views, but it's ironic, or it's certainly coincidental to me. Is that something you say a lot? Is that coincidental or something?
Yeah.
Or coincidence? I doubt it, or something.
Yeah.
He's in the middle of an ancient Roman Empire that is known as the city on the 7 hills, and or 7 mountains. And look, it's probably Rome. Okay, that's how I take it. But anyway, he says, but they are also 7 kings.
Right.
So right there, you see, oh look, the heads themselves are used as different symbols. He's trying to make a point, and he's, the number 7 is obviously very spiritually important. But I think that the point here is that he uses symbols for different meanings depending on what he's trying to say. So he's saying, I think the implication there is he's saying, look, that 7 has a reference to 7 mountains. That's the beast as a whole is the empire, but those heads are kings. And then he says 7 kings, 5 of whom have fallen. Mm-hmm. 1 is, the other has not yet come. And when he comes, he'll be only a little while. So however you're going to interpret that, it's very fascinating to me that this is one of the few places in Revelation where John is literally giving us a timestamp and saying, look, right here and now, there's one of these heads now is. And by the way, 5 of them previously are fallen. And there's another one yet to come. So he's sort of speaking historically right then and there. Now, how I interpret that, how I see it fits, is that the 7 heads in this passage are referring to Caesars of Rome. They're the Caesars of the Roman beast. And if he's in the time of Nero, Nero was the 6th Caesar.
Okay.
5 previous ones, you can look them up, Suetonius or what have you, Augustus, I don't have them all down, but there's 5 of them before Nero that died: Claudius, Tiberius, Augustus,
Julius?
Claudius, right? I'm sorry. Yeah, Julius Caesar was, of course, the first one. Mm-hmm. And it just so happens, and 1 now is, and this is in the time of Nero. And then he says, and 1 is not yet come. And when he does come, he'll remain only a little while. Well, it just so happens historically that if John is writing this in the 60s, and I believe he is, another debatable issue, but nonetheless, when Nero dies, there is what's called the year of the 4 emperors in Rome. And it's this just turmoil. In fact, it's very fascinating. I think it also fits into the prophecies here that Rome almost collapsed because Nero was the last of the Julio-Claudian line. And that was like saying the Caesars are over. We don't have any more Caesars, But of course, what ended up happening was a new line, a new dynasty of the Flavians began. But at the time, there was a year of just civil war of Rome all over because there were men trying to take the throne, and there was 4 emperors. And so the first emperor after Nero was the 6th, 1 now is, and then the 7th that came after him was Galba, and Galba reigned only 6 months, a little time. So my understanding of this is that these are some of the amazing coincidences that tell me. Can you think that this is something referring to even an additional future? You might be able to, but why would you if it has distinct reference right then and there? It makes more sense to me.
Yeah. I've made that very same argument about Ezekiel 38 and the claim or the belief that Ezekiel was in Ezekiel 38 prophesying Russia as part of this coalition that comes against Israel because of the use of the Hebrew word Rosh in that sentence, talking about Gog of the land of Magog, chief prince of Meshech and Tubal. Some will say prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal, and say, well, Rosh means Russia, Meshech means Moscow, Tubal is Tobolsk. That's been popular ever since 1917 when the Bolsheviks took over, and it got more popular after the Cold War. But Rosh is not a proper name. It's nowhere used in the Bible as a proper name. And besides, how would people in the 6th century BC reading Ezekiel have interpreted? By the same token, how would people in the 1st century AD have interpreted what John was writing?
Yes, that's my
same point.
And then you were saying the 10 heads, but the 10 crowns, 10 horns are very important too. So next thing is the 10 horns. And this is something that I think there's also another amazing coincidence. In verse 12 of 17, he says, and the 10 horns that are on there, first of all, you got 7 heads and 10 horns. What is like one of them must have 2 horns and,
Yeah.
Again, it's symbolism. It's not, and he goes, the 10 horns you saw are 10 kings and who have not, and by the way, when the Bible uses the word kings, I'm sure you'll agree with me on this, it's a generic phrase that any ruler is referred to as a king. I mean, Herod Agrippa was a king, referred to as a king, and he wasn't a king. So it's basically rulers are referred to as kings in a generic sense. So he says 10 kings who have not yet received royal power, but they are to receive authority as kings for 1 hour. Again, that's a symbol, together with the beast. What does that mean? Let me add one more thing. It's at the bottom where he brings back those the 10 horns in verse 16. He says, the 10 horns you saw, they and the beast will hate the prostitute, the harlot. Remember I said that I see that as apostate Israel. They're going to hate the harlot. They will make her desolate and naked and devour flesh and burn her with fire. Right. So it's like, okay, they're going to attack her. So I think those are 10 rulers. And like you said, I think they are the 10 client kings. I don't think 10 has to literally be literal because, again, symbolic numbers. I think it just represents a group of kings. Now, it so happens that I have found 10 client kings who were part of the auxiliary forces who joined Vespasian. So he had 4 legions, but he also had auxiliaries from client kings from Syria, from Nabatea, which is where the origin of Muslim beliefs comes from.
Yes,
so
Edom, basically. Petra was in Nabatea, was the main city of Nabatea.
Yes, exactly. So I actually bring in some of that with the Allah and the daughters of Allah.
I noticed that,
and Allah's battle between Hubal. So people will find, I think Divine Council people are going to really love some of this cool stuff. And I try to make it consistent with the facts of the historical. In other words, the historical nations that are helping them out. I have the gods who are related to them, like the Macedonian legion that is there. The patron god over that Macedonia is Spain, right? Yeah, or no. Wait, did I get that? It was Greek. It was Greek. Macedonia was Greek.
Right.
I'm thinking something else. So I have a Greek deity over that legion, that kind of a thing. So I do that throughout the series. Anyway, so back to these client kings and how I think they're the 10 horns. Well, what actually happened? So what happened in the siege was when the whole point of the Roman Empire was they would conquer the nations, but they allowed them to have their own rule and their own gods and all that kind of stuff. They just had to give obeisance to Caesar and they had to serve Caesar when he called them up for wars, right?
Right.
But other than that, he let them do what they want, which is one of the reasons why Roman Empire was so successful for so long, right? So these client kings, that's what a client king was. So if you get called up, you got to go. And so that's what he did. So you've got a half a dozen of these different client king nations, which, by the way, that's one of the reasons why when you read about things about the nations coming against, in Revelation, I see that as the Roman Empire, because the Roman Empire was all the nations and it consisted of all the nations. And look, maybe not every single nation joined them. But,
because they were still feuding and fighting with the Parthians off to the east, who had invaded as far as Judea within 100 years prior to the to the action that you're describing here. So it wasn't that long before Jesus' birth, in fact, that the Parthians controlled Palestine. So they
exactly.
So it wasn't all the nations.
Right. And by the way, in my book, End Times Bible Prophecy, I prove it biblically that the phrase all the nations are used in very specific passages in the Bible that are clearly not literally all the nations. It's a reference to basically, it's like all the nations are here. It's like all the peoples that are around me have come against me, that kind of a thing. So so that's where, but this is where this fulfills that notion where, we can get into Armageddon, the next book, because that's where I focus on it. But nonetheless, this hints in that direction. So these client kings are joining and Syria, which was actually, had a relationship with Israel, right? And they're just north of there. And at the time, they didn't have anything against Israel, but they joined and they plundered the land and ultimately, of course, destroyed the temple. And but here's the thing. So he says they have not yet received royal power. Well, what does that mean? Well, what happened was these nations would not have power to war unless Rome gave it to them, and you joined Rome, and you then had the power of Caesar behind you.
Okay.
And they're given the power for the short time, the 3.5 years. But then when the war was over, they had to go back, and their power was given back. So this notion of the being given the royal power, they're joining Caesar. Caesar gives them the power to do the battle, to do the war, and they destroy Israel, the harlot prostitute, and make her desolate and burn her with fire.
But now
we can go into the harlot if we need to. I don't know if we talked about that last time, but I think that's pretty important.
I would agree. Sadly, this time is going by very, very quickly, and I try to keep these to a manageable length for people to listen to in one sitting, and we're already at about 40 minutes in. The woman that you saw is the great city that has dominion over the kings of the earth. So how do you?
What is it? Godawa? How can you possibly say that?
Took the words right out of my mouth.
I hope this is not another.
So I'm sure you probably heard that question. So if the woman is the great, if the woman is the great city, and this is why a lot of Bible or prophecy scholars will identify the harlot as Rome, because Rome, at least in the first century, was powerful. But again, if we study history, we understand that Rome never defeated the Parthians. In fact, the Parthians put a really big hurt on the Romans about 100 years before this, when Crassus lost legions out in Mesopotamia. He was out there fighting a war to try to burnish his own credentials because he was jealous of Pompey the Great and Julius Caesar. He managed to get an entire legion destroyed by the Parthians, who, again, were never really submitted to Rome. The Parthians controlled what is now Iran today, and they weren't that far away. And like I said, the Parthians had control of Palestine in the 1st century BC. So not long before all of this is taking place, the Parthians were a major player in Palestine. One of the reasons Herod the Great became a client king of Rome was because he promised to keep the Parthians at bay. And so Rome backed his play and made him a very wealthy man, created the Herodian dynasty. And of course, they play a very important role in your novel here, Resistant. Yeah. But like I said, but Rome, I think many scholars, by the way, don't know enough about history. I appreciate that you've got a better grasp on it than a lot of prophecy scholars do, because Rome was never as powerful as we like to think Rome was, and maybe that's because our worldview here in the West is based on Roman, philosophy and culture and stuff.
Sure.
But they will interpret the woman, the Scarlet Woman, who rides the beast, as Rome or the Roman Church. So obviously you're not going that direction here if you're calling it apostate Judaism. So how do you reconcile that with verse 18 when the woman is the great city who has dominion over the kings?
Yeah, the woman can't be Rome, because then you got Rome sitting on Rome. It's kind of a contradictory image. I mean, there's lots of other reasons, but I don't even have to discredit the other viewpoints, because this is one of those sentences. And I'll try not to make this 20 minutes without stopping. But this is one of my favorite important things. I think, and I know we'll end on this, but I think this is a good one to end on, and maybe we can have a continuing talk for
probably
another
should,
time.
because we're only scratching the surface here.
Yeah, no, really. So the harlot, this is a whole other topic, and it's very important who is the harlot, and there's I want to try to address this by addressing an important issue that I think is a reason why we miss a lot of the understanding. And this gets down to, I hate to say it, some of it is translation issues. And some of it is these words, we read words in English that are not necessarily well translated.
Yep.
And we just, this is great city has dominion over the kings of the earth. Jerusalem didn't have dominion over the kings of the earth. Okay, let me walk through a couple things. One is the harlot. Okay, this phrase of the harlot or the great prostitute. What does it mean? Well, first of all, it can't mean a pagan nation. And I'll tell you why. And it cannot mean a pagan nation. In fact, it can't mean anything any nation that isn't in covenant with Yahweh, because this is a tradition that John is drawing from, goes all the way back to prophets. All the Old Testament prophets, you look it up. The concept of harlot was only used of Israel in the Old Testament by the prophets.
That's true.
Why?
Yeah.
And it didn't mean just a prostitute. It basically meant you are an unfaithful wife. You're going out and whoring with the other gods. And they said it over and over and over again. So John's just saying the same thing. But why is that relevant? Well, because only a woman who's covenanted in marriage with a husband can be called an unfaithful harlot.
Mm-hmm.
So pagan nations can't be that. Now, someone might be able to make the argument of the Roman Catholic Church because, maybe that's Roman Catholic Church, whatever. I don't think that that's the case. I don't want to go into that because I want to focus on my point here. But when it's only used of nations which God is in covenant with, which is Israel. Now, there are 2 times when it is used of 2 cities that you would say, it's used of Tyre in one passage, Ezekiel, I think, and it's used of, I can't remember. Sorry. Nineveh.
Okay. All right.
Guess what happened in Nineveh?
Destroyed.
Nineveh repented.
Well, it's true.
Nineveh
Yeah.
repented. And they got into covenant with Yahweh. And Tyre, and so that's why he would use it of Nineveh. And Tyre was in covenant with Solomon in building the temple. So it's not, I'll admit, it's not a strict covenant, but it's certainly a unique covenantal situation. Nobody else has ever called that. So my point is, right off the bat, the harlot imagery is always used of Israel already. And you can't be a harlot before Yahweh. And it's a spiritual harlot. The text is obviously clear about that. It can only be Israel from how I'm seeing it here. So that's the first word. The second word, going down in verse 18, where you said the woman, which is the harlot that you saw, is the great city, has dominion over the kings of the earth. Right. Kings of the earth. This is a very unfortunate thing. And I wrote a whole article on this. This word earth is a very unfortunate translation. I don't think it means what people think it means. You keep using that word. I don't think it means what you think it means. I will prove it to you in one step, but let me just make the point here that the word gay is actually land. And yes, it can mean land in a broad sense, but it most often doesn't. Mm-hmm. And it certainly doesn't mean globe because they didn't have that understanding. Right. Their understanding of the world was the Roman Empire and such. But that's just generic. But the actual Greek word itself, and so if it's land, it's going to change the meaning, and I'll explain to you how. But the way to the proof for it that will be undebatable, in my opinion, go back to Revelation 1, where Revelation 1:7, John is telling us this is the theme of the book. He says, behold, he's coming with the clouds, and every eye will see him, even those who pierced him. All the tribes of the earth will wail in account of him. See, it's the tribes. No, it's tribes of the land. And not only that, but when an ancient Israelite heard the word tribes of the land, what do you think he thought of? The tribes of the land of Israel. Right. And I'm not just saying this, because if you look up the verse he's quoting, he's referring to Zechariah 12. Go ahead and read it. It's clear that it's the tribes of Israel that he is quoting. And so that verse in Zechariah is clearly the tribes of the land. And why? Because they pierced Messiah. In other words, he's reaffirming that Jesus is going to judge those who pierced him, his people, Israel, and they're going to wail on account of him. And now take that word earth, change it to land throughout the rest of Revelation like it should be. Yes, sometimes it means a broader aspect, but I think mostly it's the land of Israel. And that's going to change that's why I don't think it's the Revelation is about the judgment of all the earth, of the globe, because the context, the language itself indicates it's localized and it's the land of Israel that he's focusing on. And then the last, and you can jump in or afterwards, I'll try to give you I'll try to give it time to address this if you need to, if you have questions or issues. But the last word that I just wanted to address then was the great city. And there's a few of these words in Revelation that it's just amazing to me how we miss. The text tells us what the word means, but we miss it because of our preconceived notions. And this is one of those words. And I'll prove it to you in one step. The great city. Oh, that can't be Jerusalem. you read Fall of Babylon, it's like, oh my gosh, the great city. Well, it is Jerusalem. And John even defines it as Jerusalem because the only other place in Revelation where the word the great city is used is Revelation 11:8. And he says the dead bodies of the two witnesses will lie in the street of the great city. Symbolically, it's called Sodom and Egypt, where their Lord was crucified. That's Jerusalem, baby. So the great city. Now, of course, I can explain to you how, and Josephus says this, the Old Testament says this. I can show it to you, but we don't have the time. Jerusalem is referred to as the great city, covenantally and spiritually, obviously. Because it doesn't, it wasn't like the Roman Empire, right? But from God's perspective, it's the great city, and it has dominion over the kings of the land, which is the land of Israel. But then that's going to fall, and that's where God is ultimately leading us. So that's my quick arguments of some of the cases, some of the reasons why I think if you look close in Revelation, it's not so crazy to say that, it's not about the judgment of the whole earth. It's about the land of Israel. And, and there's one other little word one other little phrase that I may have said this to you before that I like to refer to. Another one of these, John tells us exactly what he's meaning, and Christians jump over it, and I don't understand why. I could talk to you about, all these things shall shortly take place a dozen times. Come on, you guys, 2,000 years is not shortly. I realize there's debate over the nuances of words, but that's one of those things that sort of says, well, he's thinking that they're shortly going to take place to him, But more importantly, he says in Revelation 1 verse 9, I, John, your brother and partner in the tribulation, was on Patmos. So that's another one. Well, come on. He's saying the tribulation is going on right now when I'm in Patmos. And that's another case right in the text. I says, well, it's amazing how we don't see these things. And it's not generic tribulation. That's whole tribulation. I don't know the Greek word for tribulation, but it's the word "the" before tribulation in Greek that indicates the specific tribulation that we've heard about. Jesus said the great tribulation, all this kind of stuff. So these are just a few, and believe me, there's a lot more of these kinds of things that when I read them, it's like, well, I'm not coming to the text and giving some like bizarre interpretation that I can twist everything to make it fit. Most of this comes from the text itself and looking into the images and symbols that you're seeing in Revelation, finding their precedent in the Old Testament, and that sheds light on the meaning. Is that fair? Is that at least a fair argument?
It is fair. As we said, I think we're just scratching the surface here, and there are plenty of other things that we should discuss. So we'll have to make an appointment to do this again. Because there are certain things that would seem to indicate that they would be so earth-shattering, prophetically, so earth-shattering and literally earth-shattering that they would be impossible to miss. And even smaller things like the two witnesses, called up to heaven. I mean, I know you've got the two witnesses in the novel here. I've not read far enough in there to see what happens to them, but the Bible says they're going to die and then be resurrected. So, but you've got an explanation for that in the book?
Yeah. By the way, I want to take a second to just say, just because I believe that John says in verse 1:1 of Revelation that these are the things that are symbolized, the word in Greek is semiosis, symbolized to John. Okay. Just because I believe that it's predominantly symbolism that we have to interpret these doesn't mean there isn't any, literal references. And that's the difficulty of exegesis, is we have to discern, well, what is more literal, like 3.5 years, 1,260 days. I would argue that is literal. But even then, it's not hyper literal because it doesn't go to the day. The war of the Jews, 3.5 years. It doesn't go to the hour, right? So so I acknowledge that there are going to be some more literal references than others. So the problem is we just have to prove, well, why do you think this case is more literal? Sure. And in that sense, I would argue that I don't have a problem with if the witnesses are literal, that they could be killed and resurrected, because I believe that God does that stuff. You know what I mean? Sure. As a matter of fact, I'm not sure that the witnesses are literal, but I do that in the novel because I write theological novels, and I have a literal Leviathan with 7 heads, so I'm trying to communicate theology and integrate with imagination, and it's a risky adventure, but yeah, so I think that while the 2 witnesses, more importantly, I think symbolize the law and the prophets, Elijah Muhammad, that was bad. Cut that, edit that. Elijah and Moses.
Right.
And therefore, I think that's part of what's judging Israel. The law and the prophets are judge Israel, why she's condemned and why she's going to be judged. And so this is this could be very much a symbolic picture. But I'm not against it being also being literal. You just have to prove your case, I guess, in each scenario, or you just speculate. And this is why I have a lot of people who come to me and they say, Brian, what you're saying makes a lot of sense. I really, I can't deny some of it, and I can at least see the connections. So I think it did happen back then, and it's going to happen in the future. And look, I can't dissuade you of that. Because that's arbitrary. Anyone can do that, and I can't say, well, no, it's not going to be. So there are people who say that
already, but not yet. Yeah.
Like these are going to have like double fulfillments or something.
Mm-hmm.
I don't believe that that's the case. But there are people who do that, and that's another reason why they can enjoy my books. They start to see this other viewpoint, and they can accept it without rejecting their old viewpoint.
Right. Well, and there's a lot more to discuss, and this is the kind of thing we probably ought to do over coffee sometime when next time we get together in Jerusalem or something. Because there's a lot of stuff here that I see tied to the Old Testament. For example, Ezekiel's condemnation. Or his lament over the city of Tyre is paralleled, I think, in John's lament over Babylon. And I think the reason is because both the city of Tyre and the city of Babylon originated with the Amorites, whose iniquity may not yet be complete. I'm going to explore that in my next book. The Amorites have a lot. Yeah. So, but you can see the parallels in terms of the laments there, the lamentation on both cases. I think there's a connection to the spirits or the gods who were worshipped by the Amorites.
And there is significant scholarship that argues that, in fact, Ezekiel is probably John draws from more Old Testament scriptures than any New Testament book. But Ezekiel, he actually follows the outline of Ezekiel. I've seen that, and it makes a lot of sense. But don't forget, what was Ezekiel prophesying? The destruction of the temple.
Well, he was
rebuilt,
and clearly,
and the coming new temple, which I would argue Jesus said the temple of God is the people of God, the Church of Jesus Christ.
Right.
So, again, Ezekiel's addressing Israel and judgment on Israel, the destruction of the temple, as part of their, why God's judging them because of their faithlessness. So I would say that's another parallel that I see. But yeah, let's talk some more, and I would love to hear your thing about the Amorites, because that's new to me. And I've always respected your historical study of material, which is why, fans of Derek, I have quoted Derek in some of my footnotes of the latest novel, because your work on the Cosmic Mountains, we have an agreement on that in the past, and all the spiritual importance of those mountains, and that Amorite mountain actually comes to play in my story as well. And I've appreciated your work on that, because I also follow your academia.edu bookmarking.
And all,
I actually
the things
follow
that
your bookmarking. And I bookmark them because you read some cool stuff. So
there's a lot
I just can't keep up with you.
There's a lot of cool stuff out there. Well, and back at you, brother. I do appreciate it. The Chronicles of the Apocalypse. Where is the best place for people to get their own copies of the books to decide for themselves if you're onto something here, or like me, way out in left field?
Or if you just want to be entertained.
There you go.
Yeah. Everything's exclusively Amazon. All my books are in ebook, paperback, and audiobook on Amazon. I go there exclusively. And but if you want to look into it a little bit more beyond the book descriptions and all that, Godawa.com, click on the Chronicles of the Apocalypse tab, And I provide a website with a lot of free scholarly articles and books, by the way, about things like Revelation that are according to my view, and a lot of artwork I have on there that fits with the novels. And I explain a lot of things if you want to learn more before you get into it. And one of those things is the research tab on their Chronicles of the Apocalypse.
Right. I
have a bunch of there's some free books that will even address a lot of the issues of this preterist viewpoint that people have from men who are far more smart than I am, brilliant scholars. And one of my favorite, actually, and I'll end with this, is Ken Gentry. In fact, he has a commentary on Revelation that's coming out at the end of this year, which I believe is game changing in Revelation commentaries. I got the honor of being able to use it, get an advanced copy, and use it in my research of this novel series because he's a friend of mine. And if you sign up at Godawa.com for my updates, I will let you know when that book is out. I'm going to try to get because I'm friends with him, I'm going to try, I don't know if the publisher will let me, but get a code where you can get a discount on it, because it's a Revelation commentary and it's from a preterist viewpoint, but unlike anything I've seen out there. And I think that it'll be really interesting.
Very, very cool. Godawa.com is Brian's website. You'll find all of the links there for his research and, of course, for the novels in the series, Chronicles of the Apocalypse, and his earlier series, Chronicles of the Nephilim and Chronicles of the Watchers, and other writings that Brian has done. We've been following his work for years, even before I started doing this podcast, in fact, listening to your interviews with Reverend Todd Wilkin on Issues, Etc., which is how I first became aware of your work. And by the way, that's a great show, even if you're not a Lutheran. Brian, thanks very much for your time and for sharing the book. And as soon as mine's out, you'll get the PDF copy, and then we'll talk again soon.
Sounds good.
Again, you'll find Brian's website at Godawa.com, Godawa.com, and he's got links there to the books and also the reference sources and the nonfiction work that he's produced to support his theses, which, again, to be fair, I disagree with. But I appreciate the fact that Brian has done his research and is not just pulling stuff out of the air. He's got scriptural and scholarly support for his point of view. So it's worth considering. In that sense, this is iron sharpening iron, because I'm finding that even from last fall, when I first gave a presentation on the topic of Ezekiel 38:39, the Gog-Magog war, I've changed my mind about the identity of Gog of Magog and come up with a new theory on the identity of the Antichrist, while connecting the Gog-Magog war to Armageddon, so which I consider future events. So check out Brian's work, and if you're looking for a good fiction series that really depicts in a very cinematic way the divine council concept, the idea that these small g gods are trying to overthrow the creator, God Most High, and also competing with one another. And of course, I mean, besides Sharon's Red Wing saga, do check out Brian's Chronicles of the Nephilim, Chronicles of the Apocalypse, and Chronicles of the Watchers, and you'll find all of those linked at Godawa.com. Check the show notes, vftb.net, or if you're watching this on the YouTube channel, youtube.com/Derek Gilbert, you'll see it below the video, right here, somewhere down here. Very quickly, to just cover a couple of things, the schedule on A View from the Bunker is going to be kind of hit and miss for the next couple of months, probably. Very busy. Got a new book that's going to be coming out in just a couple of weeks. Last Clash of the Titans, The Second Coming of Hercules, Leviathan, and the prophesied war between Jesus Christ and the gods of antiquity. And between doing some promotional stuff for that, conferences that we got coming up, and I'll tell you about those in just a second, and just various and sundry other things, beginning to work on a next book for spring of 2019. Really don't have a good way to predict and schedule and make sure that I'm going to be doing this every single week. So I appreciate you following and keeping up to date with the website and the podcast. And of course, if you subscribe, whether it's through Spreaker, Stitcher, we're now on iHeartRadio, subscribe to my YouTube channel, youtube.com/Derek Gilbert. You get a notice every time there's a new program posted. I would like to do one per week, but between the daily routine at Skywatch TV and the things that we're doing for the other projects, not least of which includes some preparations for next spring's tour of Israel, which I'll also tell you about in a minute. There's just a lot going on. So View from the Bunker, sadly, is going to probably suffer a bit. The same goes for PID Radio. Sharon and I had started producing PID Radio again, and we just find that the schedule that we keep is difficult. She's working very hard to get the 5th novel in the Red Wing Saga series out in time for the September conference in Branson. She'll probably make it, but she's working really hard on that. She puts a good, well, I'd say 40 hours a week is the minimum that she puts in, just researching and writing on this series. So between her work on that, my work on the forthcoming book and other things, PID Radio, when we can fit the time in, we'd love to do more, but again, that and View from the Bunker probably going to be kind of hit and miss for the foreseeable future. We will, however, maintain a weekly schedule when we're home on our weekly Bible study, the Gilbert House Fellowship. We just completed Ezekiel 39 today. That's Sunday, July 29th. So you'll find the study. And we actually went back and even though we had done half of chapter 39 last week, we went back and discussed it further this week to clarify a couple of things and also to make very clear who the travelers are, who Ezekiel was talking about when he identified the victims of the slaughter, the sacrificial feast that will result from the defeat of the hordes of Magog in the valley of the travelers. Who are the fat beasts of Bashan? And why does Ezekiel go out of his way to identify these creatures as warriors, and specifically chariot warriors? So that required just an entire episode there. We'll pick up with Ezekiel 40 in a couple of weeks because we're going to be on the road for the next 2 weeks. This coming weekend, August 3rd and 4th, we'll be at the Sons of God, Giants of Old Conference in Lubbock, Texas. This is hosted by The Fellowship, a church in Lubbock pastored by Dan Crestman, who will be one of the featured speakers. I'll be talking about the forthcoming book, Last Clash of the Titans, which, to just put a fine point on it, is Armageddon. This conference will also feature Dr. Judd Burton, author of Interview with the Giant, Ethno-Historical Notes on the Nephilim and the Nephilim Dossier. He will be there along with Dr. Gregory Reed, who's an expert on satanic ritual abuse, and Joe Taylor from the Mount Blanco Fossil Museum. All of us speaking on the subject of biblical giantology. Sons of God, Giants of Old Conference, August 3rd and 4th, Friday and Saturday. The conference cost, registration is only $5. Only $5. Now, you can register in advance or buy your ticket at the door, but because this is in a church, seating will be limited, so I'd recommend registering in advance with Dr. Judd Burton. He's hosting it and handling the registrations at his website, burtonbeyond.com. That's burtonbeyond.com. Again, the Sons of God, Giants of Old Conference, Lubbock, Texas, next weekend, August 3rd and 4th, and hopefully we can see you there. The following weekend, Sharon and I traveled to Long Island. The Hyatt Regency Long Island hosts the Hear the Watchman Conference, Lifting the Veil. And this will be a really unique gathering. August 9th through 11th, we'll be there. I'll be speaking again about my forthcoming book, which should be out by then. Don't know if I'll have any with us in Long Island, but the book will be out, along with Pastor Carl Gallups, L.A. Marzulli, Rabbi Zev Parat, Pastor Mike Spalding, Dr. Michael Lake, Casper McLeod, and a new addition to the speakers roster, John Ramirez, former Satanist, now Christian, talking about his journey from the dark side to the light. That should be fascinating and worth it alone. You can save $20 off registration by using the promo code Gilbert20, Gilbert20 at hearthewatchman.com. But if you can't make the trip to Long Island, you can sign up for the video stream. And that essentially gets you 2 conferences for the price of 1, plus a 20% discount with the promo code Gilbert20. Sign up for the video stream. You'll get the video from all of the presentations for the Long Island Conference, plus all of the presentations from the Hear the Watchman Conference in March in Dallas. 2 conferences for the price of 1 and 20% off. Gilbert20. Use that promo code when you check out at hearthewatchmen.com. And then August 12th, by the way, although the bus is full, they are taking people for a waiting list. The Mystery Montauk Tour will go to Camp Hero on Long Island, which was the site of the Montauk Project, which inspired the Netflix series Stranger Things. That'll be hosted by Russ Dizdar, L.A. Marzulli, Sharon, and me, and that is going to be a fascinating day. In September, Sharon steps up and speaks as one of the featured presenters at the Transhumanism and the Hybrid Age Conference. That's True Legends, coming to Branson, Missouri, September 14th through the 16th. There are only about 100 seats left for this conference. The 3,000-seat theater almost completely sold out. So if you want to attend in person, you've got to register quickly at gen6.com, GEN6.com. Steve Quayle, Tom Horn, Timothy Alberino, Dr. Hugo DeGaris, David Knight from Infowars.com, and now Richard Dolan, a very well-known UFO researcher, all talking about transhumanism and the new age of man into which we're moving, or should we say the post-human era. That's September 14th through the 16th at the Mansion Theater in Branson. If you can't be there, this also features a live video stream. The video is available at, and again, you get a great deal here, 2 for the price of 1. You'll not only get the live video from this year's conference, you get all of the archived conference presentations from last year's conference on the Giants. So, again, GEN6.com for that conference. And then in October, Sharon and I travel out east again to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania for the East Coast Prophecy Conference. This is from Southwest Radio Church. Dr. Larry Spargimino and Dr. Bob Glaze. Tom Horn, one of the featured speakers. Joe Artis Horn, our colleague from Skywatch TV, also speaking. Stephen Strang, author of God and Donald Trump, and yours truly, talking about the Gog-Magog conflict and why the Gog of Magog will not be human. I'll also be speaking about the importance of mountains, basically pulling out the presentations from, or rather basing a presentation on my previous book, The Great Inception, just talking about the reality of the divine council concept and showing where in the Bible God specifically directed his actions and the actions of the prophets and apostles at these small g rebel gods. That's the East Coast Prophecy Conference, October 18th through the 20th. That's a Thursday through Saturday conference at the Wyndham Gettysburg in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. To register, log on to swrc.com, swrc.com, and do it quickly because this one is also filling up. A chance to see Tom Horn speak? Yeah, not surprising. So that's what's ahead on our calendar. Again, since we'll be away next weekend, the August 3rd and 4th for the Lubbock Conference and the 9th through the 12th for the Long Island Conference for Hear the Watchman. Our Gilbert House Fellowship will be back the following weekend. So until then, we hope you can go back through and try to make sense out of our comments and study on the Gog-Magog conflict, Ezekiel 37, 38, 39. Please give this podcast a review, Stitcher, Spreaker, iHeartRadio, wherever else you happen to find us. Of course, we are available wherever fine podcasts are sold. And give our Facebook page a like. That's facebook.com/viewfromthebunker, which is a production of Gilbert House and released under Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives 4.0 International License. The opening theme is by Kevin MacLeod. His website is incompetech.com. Remember, we wrestle not against flesh and blood. I'm Derek Gilbert, and this is A View from the Bunker.